Alright, we're now in the cellar. Is that the right word? I think it is. We're underground in the basement. Let's just call it the basement. Wandering spirit. Kishan's footsteps echoed in a way that startled him. Were his footsteps always so loud? Perhaps it was just a contrast with the surrounding environment, which seemed to completely silent, that made his footfalls. Alright, let's just unlock it. Kishan's footsteps echoed in a way that startled him. Were his footsteps always so loud? Perhaps it was just a contrast with the surrounding environment, which seemed completely silent, that made his footfalls seem so jarringly loud as he walked along the catwalk. He was on a catwalk. Why was he on a catwalk? There seemed to be a gaping space below him, filled with some sort of mist that he couldn't see through. It was fog-like, and yet, despite the fog that lapped at his feet, the air felt so dry. The air was thick here. As he breathed heavily, Kishan felt an overwhelming sweet, sickly odor, like the smell of wet or rotting wood. But all he could see around him were steel beams and a concrete path in front of him. Was it rust he was smelling? No, he knew the smell of rust. This was different. This smell was somehow organic, like the smell of a forest after a fresh rainfall. Kishan shivered. Far in the distance he could see what looked like a building of some sort, so far away that it made the structure he was inside feel almost tunnel-like, as if its only purpose was to convey him to that distant building. He continued walking forward, but as he walked, the building seemed to be growing more and more distant. He quickened his pace, and as he walked faster, he could feel himself moving through the thick, stifling air. Yet, as he looked down, he could see the texture of the catwalk in front of him unchanged, as though he were walking in place. Kishan started to turn backward, but saw only a blinding light. His eyes immediately shut, and when he opened them, he was again facing into the tunnel, with the distant building at the center of his field of view. He tried turning around, but every time he tried to turn his head, his eyes involuntarily shut at the sight of the light, and he was forced to close his eyes or look away, always confronted again with the sight of the small hut when he opened his eyes. His heart pounded violently inside of his chest. The tunnel was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat, feel his own pulse inside of his head. Something about this place felt deeply, incredibly wrong. Get back. I have to get back. He tried turning again, and this time found himself unable to even begin rotating his body before his eyes snapped shut, placing him again in a world of darkness, until he opened them again and was confronted with the sight of the small hut in the distance, now looking more far away than ever. I have to get back. Kishan kept facing the building and took a step backward. As he placed his foot on the ground, he felt a gust of wind knock him forward. He let out a yelp of terror. Instinctively, his hands reached for the opposite edges of the catwalk as he fell, trying to steady himself for fear of falling off. The catwalk was wide enough that his body didn't land close enough to the edge for that to have been a risk, and yet, as he looked toward the edge, he felt a growing sense of dread, that there was something down there that would capture him if he allowed it to catch even the smallest hold of him. Almost as he fought it, he felt the sensation of something pressing against his legs. He stumbled to his feet. He ran forward. The hut ahead of him seemed to grow no closer as he ran, but he ran all the same, running not to reach a destination, but to be away from whatever it was that was behind him. Moments ago, his only thought was an overwhelming desire to turn back, a worry that he was somehow trapped in here. But now, that worry was replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread that propelled him forward. He had been pushed forward by something. Something was behind him. Kishan leaned forward and ran. He was no runner. He often found himself winded when forced to climb more than one flight of stairs. And yet he ran and felt no sense of tiredness holding him back, no need to catch his breath. Maybe it was the thick air here that somehow never allowed him to run out of breath. Maybe it was that the fear of whatever was behind him was that strong. Kishan felt the air stinging at his eyes as he ran. By now he was running so fast that the thick air felt like a hot wind on his face. Tears began running down his face, but he couldn't find it in him to raise a hand to wipe at his eyes. That would mean slowing his sprint. So he closed his eyes, fully aware that he was running down a catwalk that had no handrail on either side. At this point, he didn't care. He ran and ran. Long after the tears on his face had dried, Kishan realized that he could hear only the sound of his own feet as they struck the catwalk. He couldn't even hear the rush of wind, even as it seemed to buffet his face. There were no sounds of anyone or anything pursuing him. Perhaps there was no pursuer at all. He allowed himself to open his eyes and look down. He looked over his shoulder. This time there was no blinding light, only a distant glow, like the light at the end of a long tunnel. In a way, it was the light at the end of a long tunnel, and in observing the dim glow of the distant light, Kishan suddenly realized just how far he had run. He turned around and saw the building right in front of him. It had windows that were covered with the same fog that covered the ground around him. Kishan reached for the door handle. He half expected it to be locked and felt a moment of panic as the handle bowed under the pressure of his hand. Was he ready to face whatever was on the other side of that door? Did he even want to enter? Did he have a choice? What was it that awaited him inside of this building? Answers or more baffling questions? Kishan looked down the tunnel and suddenly felt cold. Whatever this place was, he needed to escape it, and the only form of egress that seemed available to him was the door of this building. He leaned on the handle and felt the door swing open. Oh no, don't stop the story there. Wait, that door wasn't open before, was it? Okay, well, first off, we'll check out this place. What are you doing here? I don't have enough memories anyway. Oh, that's the second row battle royale power rankings. Anything over here? Doesn't look like it. Wait, where is that? Rotten poppy. The flower? Maddie opened an herb and... God damn it. Maddie opened a herb jar and sighed as she examined the contents. Rotten. She began pouring them down the sink. Don't have enough memories for that yet. Anything down this aisle? No. Alright. Anything in this corner of the room? No. Nothing I can open here. Beth 1. I can unlock that. Nice. Yep. Go. Let's go, little girl. The man standing in front of Beth smirked. The knife he held seemed almost slight compared to his massive hands, but that didn't make it any less intimidating. Finish this one quick, came a call from behind the knife holder. 3 men stood behind him, wearing expressions which ranged from amused to bored. Beth felt her palm getting sweaty and loosened her grip on the knife in her right hand, sliding her thumb along the guard to reassure herself that its shape hadn't changed since the moment she'd picked it up. Take your friend's advice, Beth said to the man who was menacing her. Finish this quick. After all, I'm just a little girl. Well, as little as any 15-year-old girl could be. Can do, said the man, and he drew his knife up for an overhead swing. The man's movement suggested that he didn't know how to use a knife. Not really. He was swinging the knife like he'd swing a fist, like he was trying to bludgeon her with it, like he'd never really used a knife before. He was stupid. Mercifully stupid. She tried to reassure herself of that fact, trying not to lose her resolve. He lunged toward her as he brought the knife down, and Beth raised her left arm. She felt the edge of the knife hit her skin, but the impact of the blow caused the man to lose his grip on the knife. An opening. Beth grabbed the attacker's knife arm and pulled him toward her, while thrusting her own knife toward him at chest level. She drove the knife into the man's chest with all the force she could muster, and he fell to the ground and gasped as Beth released her grip on him. The man lay on the ground and put a hand to his chest, moaning. Son of a bitch. You doing okay down there? Said Beth. The man sat up and patted his chest. I didn't expect. To lose to a girl? No, said the man. Well, that too, but I didn't expect it to hurt this much. These rubber practice knives are no joke, said Beth. If I'd stepped any harder, I might have broken a rib. The man stood up. You got a name, girl? You can call me Beth, she said, extending a hand. He shook it with a look of hesitation. I'm Kyle. I've got to say, Beth, that was kind of a cheap trick. How do you mean? Said Beth. I mean the way you blocked my knife with your arm. It just bounced right off. You couldn't do that if we were using real knives. He's right, said one of the spectators. No, who is that now? The spectator? Not really a fair fight with rubber knives. I'd like a rematch, said Kyle. Yeah, said one of the spectators. Rematch! The others began chanting along with him. Rematch! 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 A voice thundered from above. Thought I told you guys to keep it down. Everyone spun around to face the stairs leading up to the ground floor. Oh, this is Maddie. Maddie was leaning over the railing of the staircase with a stern look on her face. She tapped the poster on the wall. Beth took a moment to glance at the sign. Fight Club rules. 1. Don't quote Tyler Durden. 2. Seriously, no Tyler Durden quotes. 3. Always assume your opponent is mortal. Practice weapons only. 4. Be considerate to other guests. Keep noise to a reasonable level. We don't have many rules here, said Maddie. Please don't make me kick you out of the basement. Everyone else in the room cast a gaze downward, looking ashamed, with several mumbled apologies. Maddie nodded and climbed back up the stairs, content that she had made her point. Seriously though, said Kyle. Not really a fair fight without real knives. Beth walked over to the edge of the room and lifted a rug, revealing 2 steak knives. Several whispers erupted from the small crowd. Where'd you get these? Asked Kyle. I swiped them from upstairs, said Beth. They're not exactly combat gear, but these blades are fit to cut through flesh, whether it's a cooked steak or a human arm. Beth held one of the steak knives by the blade, presenting its handle to Kyle. We've already broken one rule tonight. How about breaking another one? I won't get hurt, said Kyle. I mean, I can still feel the pain, but you know, I'm not afraid of getting stabbed. Neither am I, said Beth. But don't say you're ready for this if you're not ready to bleed. She turned the knife over in her hands, pressing her thumb against the tip just enough to draw a single drop of blood. Kyle grinned. Do I look like I would be here if I was afraid to die? Well, I unfortunately cannot tell how you look like, so the answer to that question will have to wait. Okay, we've got the cellar, staff only. I want to be staff. Alright, and back to the terminal. So I'm assuming that every time we go back into the cafe, we unlock another area of it. Wait, don't I have memories? I can check whether I can lock each memory. Let me have a quick look if there's anything I can unlock. Billiards, yes, I can unlock billiards. It's also the only thing I can unlock. What about these things? Okay, that doesn't matter. Now the question is, where is billiards? Is that upstairs? Probably, right? I assume it is. Where's the billiard table? There it is. Alright. Let's unlock that one. Brad took a sip from his beer. It was non-alcoholic, but there was something about the taste that put him in that perfect state of ease and alertness. Maybe it was the placebo effect, maybe it was the fact that his non-alcoholic beer was still 0.5% ABV, and he was on his 5th bottle. Maybe it was the dry aftertaste that kept him frosty. Brad chased the thoughts from his head as he leaned over the table and lined up his next shot. He eyed the problematic 9 ball in the upper right corner. He had a low percentage shot on it if he elected to bank it in, but he had 2 other stripes in the lower left to set it up. If he had an audience, he'd go for the bank shot for sure. While Brett was a competitive player, a big part of what he liked about competition was the chance to shine. But today there was no one to impress, no audience for his flashy low percentage shots. He took the shots on the 11 and 12, and 3 shots later the 9 was sunk, with an easy shot on the 8 ball to seal the deal. Brett scanned the table. 4 solids remained, a dismal performance on his part, or a stellar performance on the part of the stripes player depending on how you looked at it. That was the problem with playing against yourself. You always won, but you always lost too. Every crowning victory was also a crushing defeat, and every defensive shot was an attempt to screw yourself. Brad chucked the remainder of his beer and added the glass bottle to his collection of empties, which now stood 5 bottles strong. He took a moment to survey the room. It was empty. His table was the only one of the 4 that was in use. That didn't come as any surprise to Brad. It was early in the evening and he had grown accustomed to spending time alone in this room, knowing instinctively when he could come here to be alone and what hours the other sharks showed up. Brad grabbed the triangle, it was looped around his collection of beer bottles, and started putting the balls in order for another round. Someone came up the stairs and Brad looked up briefly, long enough to see a woman who he recognized as the one who had served him the beers that had kept him company for the past hour or 2. Each time going downstairs to order another beer, she'd had a serious, almost stern expression, but over the past several visits to the bar, he'd come to like her presence. He was used to servers who attempted to flatter him, and yet this woman didn't so much as smile at him. But there was something in the way she declined to comment on his choice of non-alcoholic beer that made her seem like one of the least judgmental servers he'd ever met, and somehow that made him feel more welcome than the warmest smile a server could offer. Several steps behind the woman he saw an older looking man. The old man stopped in front of one of the tables, the one opposite Brad's, and began chalking up his cue. The barista set the wooden box of balls on the table in front of him, and she began placing the triangle on the table before the old man waved her away. Brad directed his attention to the old man. Brad usually offered people a game when they came up, but the old man seemed like he was prepared to keep to himself, so Brad said nothing and tried to focus on his own table. He set up to break and the old man coughed right in the middle of Brad's stroke. He hit the cue ball just a fraction of a degree off center and it bounced off the rack into one of the side pockets as the rest of the balls jostled around the table. Stink. Brad didn't swear when playing pool. The habit had been ground out of him early on when he started playing competitively in youth league. His earliest experiences with competitive billiards had been in an environment that forbade obscenities and issued foul penalties every time he let out an involuntary shit or fuck, so he'd had to find cleaner substitutes. I hate those. The swears he'd grown up with were still part of his everyday vocabulary, but leaning over the pool table was enough to put him in the competition mindset. Brad turned around and looked at the man, wondering if he had heard Brad. If the man had heard, he certainly didn't show it. Jizo was lined up and making several practice strokes, getting ready to break his own table. Brad turned back to his own table and tried to divorce his attention from the old man. Still, it was impossible to avoid hearing the clacking of balls on the other table, and he found himself subconsciously counting the knocks every time he heard the cue ball strike. Break came the sound from the old man's table. 2, 3, 4. Brad put down his break cue and picked up the lever-tipped cue that was leaning against the table. 5, 6. Brad chalked his cue, trying to avoid the tilt from his bad break. 7, 8. Brad lined up to shoot and realized that the old man was clearing his table, fishing the balls out of the pockets and collecting them in the triangle. Brad did a mental double take. Had the old man sunk the 8th ball after 8 strokes, including break? That's fast. Doesn't that require you to at least sink 2 balls in one once? Brad continued playing his own table, but kept an eye on the old man this time as best he could without looking like he was staring. It happened again. Break. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. A perfect clean sweep. As the old man began clearing the table, Brad walked over and piped up. "Excuse me," he said, "but I couldn't help but notice you just hit 2 perfect games." What's that? The old man turned to Brad, squinting at him. Brad repeated himself a bit louder this time. I was just complimenting you in 2 perfect games. Impressive stuff. The old man heaved his shoulders in a gesture that looked more like a sigh than a struggle. Sometimes you get a bit of luck on your side, said the man. Brad found himself annoyed by the old man's inability to accept the compliment. That kind of humility had always struck him as somehow dishonest. Still, said Brad, you won't see a novice hit 2 consecutive perfect games. You need some amount of skill to pot every ball like that. The old man offered another ineffectual shrug. Do you, want to play a game? Brad gestured to his own table, which was already set up. Most of the people who come around here tend to be novices. I've been kind of itching for a bit of competition. Brad paused and the old man said nothing. Of course, if you'd prefer to play your own table, I don't mean to intrude. We can play, said the old man. Though, if I can shoot perfect the 3rd time, you won't get to. If you could pull that off, I'd be impressed, said Brad. The old man rackled the balls and after a bit of jostling stepped away from the table to let Brad break. Brad leaned over the table and took several practice strokes before finally connecting with the cue ball. The break was weaker than he had expected, but he managed to sink 1 ball, which was enough to start his spree. Still, the break was barely legal. Brad looked at the table with a bit of annoyance and realized that he hadn't bothered to check to see that the rack was frozen before he broke. It was probably the old man's failing eyesight. Racking the balls by feel rather than sight sometimes made it possible to miss small gaps between the balls. Brad lined up his next shot, which was a straight into the middle pocket. He briefly visualized the trajectory of the cue ball in his mind. It would knock the 6th ball in easily and then bounce toward the front of the table. Brad wasn't confident of where exactly the ball would stop, but he was confident that regardless of its position, he'd be able to do something with it. He took the shot and the 6th ball went in. Solids. After the cue ball settled, he found himself with no good options. Brad smiled. Most other players in this situation might be cringing, but Brad saw this as a challenge. Making something out of nothing was his specialty, and after several moments of eyeing different angles, he settled on a shot towards one of the bottom pockets. One of the striped balls was in the way, so Brad hit the cue ball several degrees to the side, giving it just enough spin to curve its trajectory around the striped ball. It hit the solid 3 ball at just the right angle, and the shot was made. Brad looked at the old man, hoping for some kind of reaction. The old man's mouth remained a flat line, but Brad could see his eyebrows arc. Even if the reaction was subtle, Brad could tell he had made an impression. If anything, the lack of obvious expression on the old man's face struck him as deliberate, as a deliberate attempt to not show a reaction, which made the fact that he had managed to get a slight rise out of the old man feel like an even sweeter victory. Brad made his next shot quickly. He had an easy straight-in shot on the 2 ball and he made it without thinking much about where the cue ball would land, convincing himself that was a problem that future Brad would have to deal with. The 2 ball entered his pocket without putting up much of a fight, and several seconds later, present Brad found himself scolding past Brad for putting him in such a foul position. He was corner hooked. With the cue ball trapped in the nook next to the corner pocket, the only angles available to Brad existed in a 60-degree arc, a drastically tighter window than his usual 360-degree array of options. Still, after surveying his limited options, he breathed a sigh of relief as a relatively straightforward bank shot presented itself. It was an awkward angle, but Brad was sure that he could coax the 3 ball into the opposite corner pocket. He took the shot and watched as the 3 ball complied, helpfully rolling into the pocket he had designated. Unfortunately, the cue ball went with it, ending Brad's turn and placing the ball in the old man's possession. Ah, stink. The old man fished the cue ball out of its pocket, and Brad could swear he saw the man wink at him before placing the cue ball down, lining up a simple shot on the side pocket. He took the shot and the 9 went in. Then the 11 and the 12. As Brad observed each shot, he found himself taking it for granted that the striped ball would enter its designated pocket and instead focused on the cue ball. Somehow the cue ball always wound up in a position that presented the oldster with the ideal chip shot. Ball after ball fell off the bat until finally only the black 8 ball and Brad's solid colored balls remained. Fortunately for Brad, the 8 ball and the cue ball were at opposite sides of the table, with several of Brad's striped balls in between. The cue ball had always seemed to wind up in a position where it offered a shot to one of the geezer's balls, and Brett had found himself wondering whether it was careful planning on the old man's part or just a streak of good luck. The fact that the man seemed to be without any easy options made it seem like perhaps he wasn't the amazing planner that Brett had originally made him out to be, and at last the old man's luck had ran out at the moment he needed it most. The old man wore a contemplative expression as he walked around the table, inspecting different angles. He lined up several different shots but didn't commit to any of them. As the old man searched for a good shot, Brad mentally calculated what he would do if he were the one trapped in this situation. If he ricocheted the cue ball off two of the solids, he could hit the 8 ball at the right angle. Or if he put enough spin on the cue ball to curve it around the stripes, he could probably get the 8 ball in without having to bank it. Still, those were options that required a lot of dexterity and control. Dexterity and control that the old man probably lacked. It wasn't an issue of the man's age. Even a young pool player with steady hands would have trouble making one of those shots. The old man eventually gave up and settled for making a defensive shot that put the cue ball behind the 8 ball. Now the tables were turned. Brad was the one cut off from his balls by a problematic 8 ball. Brad smiled. He lived for shots like this. He lined up a shot and visualized the trajectory of the ball had, but there was really no way for him to perfectly predict how things would go. He just knew, as if by instinct, that if he hit the 8 ball at this angle, good things would happen. Brad took the shot. The cue ball hit the 8 ball and the 8 ball hit the 1 ball, and the 1 ball hit the 7 ball, bouncing against the front of the table and back into one of the side pockets. Brad smiled. Things couldn't have gone better even if he'd planned them, though in a way he was sure that his subconscious mind had been expecting things to work out like this. Instinct and muscle memory doing what his calculating mind couldn't. Now that the ball was conveniently free of striped balls, Brad had no trouble sinking. Now that the table was conveniently free of striped balls, Brad had no trouble sinking the remaining consecutive shots he needed to close out the game. As Brad lined up the final shot on the 8th ball, Brad studied the old man, looking for some kind of reaction. If the old man was responding, he couldn't tell. Brad closed his eyes as he completed the final stroke, as he always did. Brad wasn't really religious. He had stopped going to church with his mum when he was 12 years old, but somehow it felt right to complete the game with his eyes closed, as if he were lifting up some prayer and leaving the result of the game to God. "Damn," said the old man as the 8 ball fell into his pocket. Brad flinched for a moment. Nothing about the man's behavior up to that point had indicated he was impressed with Brad's abilities, but for some reason he had been expecting a bit of praise from the man for winning the game. Perhaps the damn was all that he was prepared to offer. "Excuse me," said Brad. "I don't think we bothered to exchange names. I'm Brad." "Thomas?" The old man extended a hand. "I've got to say," said Brad, "you're quite a player. I take it you're not from around here?" "No," said the man. "I grew up in Brisbane, retired in Sydney. I'm just passing through." The young man nodded. "I figured. I actually grew up in this neighborhood. I played on tables just like these way back when I was a kid, so I know most of the people around the local competitive circuit. I guess someone like you would have to play competitively, huh? You don't pick up skills like that in a tiny pond." "You'd be surprised," said Thomas. "A man can accomplish quite a bit when given enough idle time." "But you have played competitively, I assume. Why are these so wrong?" "I used to, yes," said Thomas. "I actually formally retired many years ago, but kept the table at home for practice to keep my mind sharp." "Where did you compete?" said Brad. "Oh, I toured in England," said Thomas. "Wait," said Brad. "You were a pro?" "A pro is someone who makes a salary," said Thomas. "In the end, I won enough to cover my travel expenses and enough to make up for the time I spent not working a real job." Brad was visibly excited. "You said England. Did you ever play in the WBC?" "Yeah," said the old man. "I played the WBC for a few years. Eventually I decided the title was a summit I'd never reach. So I quit." "Wait," said Brad. "Are you Thomas Walsh?" "Indeed I am," said Thomas. "You're a legend," said Brad.
think you might be overstating it, said Thomas. Even when I was at my prime, I wasn't the best. Results speak for themselves.
No, fuck that, said Brad. You're a finalist for 6 years running. Nobody's ever been that consistent. Even the best pros who manage to run a hop burn out after more than 2 or 3 years. I mean, it's really common to see guys who spike events and then fail to even qualify the next year. Brad paused, wavering a bit before throwing in a bit of humble self-aggrandizement? Aggrandizement? What is that word? I mean, that's been a big problem for me. Thomas sipped his beer. Whether he was deliberately choosing to ignore Brad's comment or simply hadn't taken notice wasn't clear. I've spent hundreds of hours watching your videos, said Brad.
I didn't realize there were videos of me, said Thomas.
I have the final tapes from 1967 and 1968. They didn't record them before that, but your last 2 years got recorded for posterity. They're kind of rarities at this point though. I had a coach who had a vault of old footage. That's how I got my hands on your videos.
Coach?
Thomas arched an eyebrow. Yeah, said Brad. Did you ever have a coach?
Thomas shook his head. We mostly just taught ourselves and taught each other. Sometimes you got to practice with people better than you were, but they weren't really coaches to teach you how to play.
Well, I mostly taught myself, said Brad. But after I started winning some regionals, I joined a team so that I could get sponsored and have a group to train with.
Interesting, said Thomas.
Brad waited for Thomas to question further, but no question came. Brad decided to continue without an invitation. I won at WBC in 2012.
No luck since then, I take it, said Thomas.
Brad stammered for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Well, yeah. Like I said, I've had some events where I managed to run hot, but I've never been a consistent player. Not like you, anyway.
Brad offered a sheepish grin.
My mum had an album full of clippings of all these articles talking about me like I was some kind of prodigy, the next big thing. Now it feels like I'll forever be a footnote in history.
Brad waited for the words of affirmation to come from his hero, but Thomas just took another drink from his glass, finishing it off before setting it down on the table next to Brad's empty bottles.
Said Brad. Can I get you a drink in exchange for another game? It would be a real pleasure.
Sure, said Thomas. Get me a Guinness. Actually, make it 2.
Brad rushed down the stairs and returned several minutes later with a tray bearing 2 pints of Guinness and 2 more NAs for himself. Thomas began setting up the table for the next game and Brad hovered over him. You know, said Brad, this place is pretty magical. I mean, getting to play a game of pool, I never imagined this would happen, but in a place like this.
I wasn't quite sure how to say it, but figured Thomas knew what he was gesturing at.
Several moments later, Brad finished a thought, just to kill the silence. I mean, this is the sort of place where anything can happen, you know what I'm saying?
Not anything, said Thomas. There are limits.
Well, yeah, said Brad. But still, 2 former champs, one coming back from beyond the grave, so to speak. That's not the kind of encounter you'd expect to have anywhere else.
Thomas arched his eyebrows. Magical indeed. When I walked up here, I didn't realize from looking at you that you were, well...
He rubbed his chin.
Let's just say that I don't beat a lot of pool pros at bars. One hell of a coincidence that it would be this night that I'm here.
He took a sip of his beer.
You want to break?
Break? Said Brad. Thomas gestured to the configuration of balls on the table. Oh, right, said Brad. Sure. It took a moment to inspect the pyramid. The rack was nice and tight. Had it been like that for the first game? Brad wondered if perhaps his senses were failing him. Brad broke and with hands guided by instinct managed to sink 5 balls consecutively. Like magic, his shots always managed to connect, even the tricky ones that involved curves and bounces. Brad found himself smiling. Some people might buckle under pressure, but Brad's performance always seemed to rise to the occasion, and now that he was presented with the opportunity to impress his mentor, every shot seemed to go in. With just 2 striped balls left, Brad knew he was on a streak, but as he lined up the shot on one of the striped balls, he took a moment to consider the position of the 8 ball. It was nestled in an awkward position behind Thomas's balls, but if he could clear a path to the 8 ball while sinking the last stripe, it was definitely doable. Brad looked at the sea of balls and knew there was no way for him to mentally calculate exactly how they'd knock around once the cue ball hit them, but instinct had gotten him this far and he wasn't about to stop listening to it now. Whatever the result was, he'd figure it out. Brad took the shot, and as predicted, the cue ball knocked the last strike ball into the corner pocket. The cue ball bounced off the table back toward Thomas's cluster of balls and hit one, which hit another and another, which hit the 8 ball. Brad found himself grinning in elation. He'd hit the 8 ball and it was headed right toward the corner, just like he predicted. It was headed right toward the corner where there were no balls to intercept it. It was headed right toward the corner into the pocket. The 8 ball slowed down, but Brad felt a sinking feeling as he knew that the friction of the table wouldn't be enough to stop it from going in. He fucked up. As the 8 ball rolled toward the pocket, Brad felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He was fully aware of the impending disaster, yet powerless to stop it. The game had been going so well up until that moment. He had been about to hit a perfect game in front of his childhood hero and now was about to lose it in the most inglorious way imaginable. Brad closed his eyes and looked away from the table. He didn't need to see it. The sound of the ball plunking into the pocket was enough to tell him that he'd just lost the game. Thomas began pulling the balls from the pockets and Brad turned back to the table to rack the balls. Moving balls around the table seemed a good way to distract himself from the embarrassing loss. Brad lifted the triangle from the table and presented the pyramid to Thomas. Here it stops. Alright, well it is Billiards 1. Jesus Christ, I've never read a story this long about billiards. Alright. I think this is taking so long that I'm gonna make a cut here and end the episode there, and we'll watch the main story in the next episode. Till then, bye.